So Jannicke has asked me to talk about two things. One, sort of the experience of starting agencies in my career and any insights I have from that. And then to go on and talk about pitching, which is a subject of perennial fascination. I'm never sure I get it right. But if I start with the title that I've given this, which I know is unusual, Amoeba in English, or Amoeba, is that right in Norwegian? Unicellular organisms which reproduce by dividing. And I've always thought that that's an exact model for how literary agencies start and operate in our world. You know, you have someone working for an agency for several years, developing their skills, developing a different vision, and then splitting off to start. And you see it time and time and time again. The genealogy of sort of the literary agency world is always people splitting off and backing their skills, often armed just with a telephone, a desk, enthusiasm, and a manuscript. So let me explain sort of how this worked for me. I studied law. I did a law degree, and after 4 years of studying law, I suddenly realized I didn't want to be a lawyer, and I somehow managed to get into publishing. And I became a postboy in the late 1980s for a famous feminist agent who got into trouble for hiring a young man. She got a lot of negative comments from all her feminist friends. But I was her postboy, and it's almost impossible to remember this, that in the late 1980s, which is not long ago, it was pre-internet, the fax was only just being used. Personal computers had been invented, but they cost thousands of dollars. So people used typewriters. They kept records of submissions on little index cards. If you wanted to submit a manuscript, you had to make 12 photocopies of it, put it in a parcel, take it to the post office, and post them. Business was conducted internationally, mainly by post, not by telephone, because it was expensive. In fact, posting itself was so expensive, people used extra thin paper to reduce their costs. I mean, it's almost unimaginable now. But for a young man, it's the one time in my life, I'm a spectacularly unathletic person. The one time in my life when I developed biceps, because I was carrying endless packages of parcels backwards and forwards to the post office all the time. And working for this woman, Sheila Watson, was extraordinary because she had been a pioneer in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. She had herself worked for Curtis Brown. She split off, started her own agency. She was an astonishing, inspiring person to work for. The only problem was everyone was so badly paid that I had to have an evening job. And she always insisted I serve her a whiskey at her desk at 6 o'clock, which was exactly when my job started. But the business was completely different. I would say at least a third of the income of authors in those days was from newspapers and magazines. Magazines buying serialization rights to novels, newspapers paying thousands and thousands of pounds for extract rights to good non-fiction books. That has completely gone. And, but I loved working there. I really loved working there. She was an incredibly inspiring person. The first time the Amoeba split, I was there for about 3 or 4 years. I learned a little bit. I learned far less than I thought I did. But nonetheless, I had a bit of confidence. And I met someone called Christopher Little, who had been an entrepreneur. He had recruitment agencies, various other things. He had a couple of clients, book authors, who did rather well. And he wanted to get rid of all his other businesses and build up the literary agency. So he mistakenly thought I knew more about the publishing world than he did. But we started working together with an assistant called Bryony Evans. And it was an absolute learning curve because neither of us knew very much. We went out there, we met tons of people. We represented commercial fiction, we represented non-fiction, we did no children's books, no poetry. And we had an assistant called Bryony Evans who, for about 2 weeks, kept annoying us and annoying us and annoying us, saying, you know, we've got this unsolicited manuscript that I've read, I've communicated with the author, I've made editorial comments, but it's a children's book. And Chris said, not interested, not interested. And then finally he read it and he took it on. And he sent it to 12 publishers who turned it down. Everyone at that stage in the children's world, we discovered, was obsessed by series and the length of a book. It had to be 20,000 words, 30,000 words, 40,000 words. This was nothing like that. And of course, that was Harry Potter. And he sold it on the 12th submission and for £2,000 advance. And it was very hard to sell. And people forget that it took about 3 years for the Harry Potter books to take off. but they did. And then suddenly the whole business changed, and we doubled in size, trebled in size, quadrupled in size. And it was an incredibly exciting period to work with someone, because it was like riding a roller coaster. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger. But at the end of that 8-year period, you know, all other clients inevitably were sort of overshadowed. And I had built up a client list by that point in narrative nonfiction and lots of young novelists and so on. And I decided the time was right to sort of leave Hogwarts. So I left Hogwarts. And the way the Amoeba split the second time was I met, and I didn't know particularly well, but I really liked an agent called Claire Conville, who was in the same situation as me. She's an absolutely brilliant agent. She's got impeccable taste. You know, she can smell talent from a mile away. And Claire and I, you know, had numerous meetings, and then we started working together. And it was just an act of willpower, I think. And the lesson, I suppose, of both the Christopher Little experience and I think the joining with the Claire Conville is, one of my mantras became, it's better not to know the rules. You know, we would never have started that agency if we'd known how hard it was to do tax and banks and, you know, get an office and employees and all of that. Chris Little would never have taken on a children's book if he'd known the rules at that time. It's just sometimes better to be blind and just to go for it. And that's something that time and time again I've experienced. So Claire Conville and I started this business. We were working from home. You know, we had no real money. You know, we had to learn all the basics, like, you know, who does the post, how do you do tax, how do you get a bank account, and so on. Really what characterized that business was energy. All we did was go out and meet people day after day after day after day after day. And I have a client now who is a multi-billionaire hedge funder and human rights activist called Bill Browder. And whenever he invested in a new area of business, he would always say he had a 40 lunch rule. And what he means by that is you literally email 40 people that you don't know and say, can we meet? Can we talk about your business? Whatever. And he says 38 of them will always say yes. You know, they are good and kind people. And that's sort of what Claire and Conville and I did. But we did it, you know, we did 100 lunches, we did 200 lunches. It was exhausting, but that's how we built the business. And what we found was that editors started recommending clients to us. And it started building that way. And the agency built from me and Claire in in our respective homes to 20, 25 staff over about a 14-year period. And what characterized it was, what characterized it very much was a sense of sort of organic growth. You know, we didn't have a business plan, we didn't have a strategy, but what we did do was work incredibly hard. And with the benefit of hindsight, I begin to see that there were certain rules that we had. We didn't articulate them to ourselves, but the key one was finding new talent, always. You know, we always wanted to find the first novel, the new historian, the academic who's that very rare person who can write for a general market. And it was always about trying to sort of create that sense of sort of that authors weren't just operating on their own, but they were part of a community. You know, there were other authors who were like them and so on, or different stages of their careers. And, you know, we started growing and enjoying it. And when I said we had no business plan, I mean, I've been thinking about this over the last few days, and it's been an interesting exercise that what I think we had were 4 rules that we didn't really articulate then, but that we lived by. The first one, the most important one, cash flow is absolutely key, as all of you know. And particularly if you're starting a literary agency, that first 2-year period, you have to survive on signature advances. That's hard. Once you get past about sort of, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years, suddenly signature advances are coming in at the same time as publication advances, foreign advances, you're doing new deals. We were obsessed by cash flow. We hounded publishers all the time to pay our authors, but partly because we'd go bankrupt without them doing so. The second rule, we would continue working as long as it was fun. This is something we talked about a lot. To the outside world, it looked like we were sometimes a sort of party agency, always having drinks and, you know, cocktail parties and meeting people. That was true on the surface, but all the time, underneath, we were obsessed by the cash flow. And the two things sort of fed each other. It was a way of finding new clients, getting sort of publicity and so on for our authors. Rule 3, in the 90s, as many people know, the vast majority of literary agencies and publishers around the world sold their international rights through partner agencies, a really good agency in Munich or in Zurich or in Tokyo or whatever. We decided from the start that we wanted to deal direct. You know, the communications had just become so easy. And we coincided with that time in the 90s when suddenly, you know, you could submit a manuscript within seconds all over the world. And so what we did is we made a massive effort to get to know all the American editors. We went over there 3 or 4 times a year. We went to every single book fair we could. We started developing really good links with sort of people all around the world. And it fed back to us. You definitely got a sense of the importance of books as a part of an international community. Also, you learned a lot about the problems that Russian publishers had with censorship, the problems Chinese publishers had with getting copyright clearance. All of this fed into a greater sense of our understanding of the world. And it was exciting learning about different cultures and different worlds. And the 4th rule, and this really benefited us, try to be the boss you never had to your staff. And what I meant by that, and we really practiced this, we had lots of very young people who came to us for their first or second jobs. And provided they did their job, we would allow them to do whatever they wanted in the rest of their time. They could take on an author, even though they had very little experience. They could try and do something new. It was worrying at times because some of these initiatives were completely insane, but broadly, it really benefited us. And it made them part of this sense of sort of excitement and so on. We made some big mistakes with our staff as well. We were so busy that a couple of times we just failed completely to notice that a member of our staff was having a breakdown or they just couldn't cope or whatever. But most of the time, I feel really proud of what we did to our staff, and it really contributed to our sense of the agency and so on. So, you know, those, I suppose, as much as cash flow, fun, I know that's not the most important thing in the world. Deal direct if you can, and try to be the boss that you wish you never had. And it worked. You know, it is an agency that by the time that we sold it, which was about 14, 15 years into its lifespan, it had become known for finding talent. It had also become known for being able to create a wave of excitement around a book around the world. We had a very good team of people who taught themselves how to sell international rights. You know, they learned on the job. And it worked very well. The reason we sold, and this is the next split of the Amoeba, is Claire and I had become very aware that it's very hard to sell a literary agency, to cash out. That in the main, most literary agencies are taken over when it's too late, you know, when the owners are tired, they're no longer working too much. We sold at a time when it was almost at the height of its excitement. And we were able to realize a good price for it at that time. There were other personal reasons why we wanted to do this, but that was the main one. And it was a very interesting exercise because we went from a slightly sort of gun-slinging agency to being part of the biggest corporate agency, which is 250 people or thereabouts, with actors departments and film television departments, every sort of department. They made it very easy for us. This isn't one of those stories where it goes terribly wrong. Most of the staff that were working for us are still at Curtis Brown and very happy there. And they have fitted in incredibly well. As in fact did I. I was very content there after the takeover and so on. But there was another Amoeba split coming along, which was that two things collided in my mind. You know, I stayed there for about 18 months or something. I was very, very content. I suddenly became aware that I could have stayed there for 20 years to see out my working life and still have been content. And that's a very odd negative, but to me that was a negative. And similarly, I have a great Arabic friend who suddenly said to me one day, you know, there are two things. You know, you can be happy, but there are other happinesses. And then she capped it with a much more bloody metaphor, which is sometimes you need to cut your own throat to breathe. and which, nice bloody metaphor, but it sort of worked for me. And so from that moment, I decided I would leave. But the problem is when you sell an agency, you know, particularly if you get a reasonable sum for it, of course, they impose restrictive covenants on you, so you can't go out and compete with them. I had to negotiate with them to leave and to be able to start again, you know, just me and a desk and a phone. And the only way I could do that was if I agreed to pay them half of everything I earned for the next 2 years from the moment going independent. And I agreed that as the price of moving on. And so 4 years ago, I left. It was just me and a brilliant assistant who, in retrospect, made an incredibly brave and foolhardy decision to work for someone he didn't know, one person in an office in London, straight out of university, but who was brilliant. And we started up and it worked well. And then 2 years ago, the training reins came off in terms of that relationship with Curtis Brown. So to the world, it looks like we've been going for 4 years, but actually we've been going for 2 years from August 2018. And in the sort of 2 years since, 3 other people have joined us. 2 ex-editorial directors of publishers, Eleanor Byrne, who used to run John Murray at Hachette in London, and Doug Young, who was the editorial director of Bantam, part of Penguin Random House. And then the third person is someone that many of you will know, Margaret Halton, who's one of the most experienced foreign rights agents in London. And we've adopted a slightly different business model. This isn't about employees, it's about a sort of collegiate thing. So in a way, we're sort of halfway between partners and employees, if that makes sense. But the great thing is my assistant started taking on and selling young novelists a couple of years ago. Doug and Eleanor, the ex-publishers, have started building a list from scratch, and it's created an incredible sense of energy and excitement for me again, because I'm surrounded by new authors again in a way that I haven't been for years. And that's, you know, there is an element of being selfish about doing all of this, but it has been hugely enjoyable. So that's my story and a few principles. So pitching. Now, everyone pitches in a different way, and I'm constantly aware that there are great pitchers out there who can do things that I can't, notably the one-line pitch. I cannot do the one-line pitch. But I think pitching is about this. The greatest skill in pitching is communicating the love you feel for a book direct to an editor in such a way that he or she can then communicate that love onwards to the world. Being an agent is about constantly falling in love with books, repeatedly, serially, and being brought alive by each project. There's no greater joy in my life. We all know from friends that when they fall in love, they smile more, they see the world more kindly. That's sort of how you want to be when you're an agent, you're going for a pitch. The prequel is selection. We've all taken on books that we don't 100% believe in. Books that you think might make money, but you don't particularly like. It takes huge confidence to turn down a book that you don't particularly like, but that you might make money from. Do your best not to. I still make that mistake sometimes, but I'm trying to be really rigorous about it. But when you do love the book, how do you pitch it in a way that creates the excitement? First, if I can talk about this in a slightly back to front way, the method of it, always try to talk to the editor in person, on the phone, on Zoom, or in person if you're lucky enough. If you love a book, they will hear your excitement, your genuine excitement, and the tone of your voice. They won't get that from an email. I spent years trying to encourage my younger colleagues to pick up the phone. It was a battle. They prefer to be able to control things by doing a text or an email, but nothing beats picking up a phone. And once they got over their fear of phoning people, it worked for them. So yes, sometimes it may take 30 phone calls to people all around the world to create a sense of excitement about a book. And there's a Groundhog Day element to it. But the upside is you communicate the excitement and you do refine your pitch. By the last call, you've got like the perfect way of describing that book. But it may take 30 phone calls. What about the pitch itself? I'm useless at the one-line pitch. So my strategy is to avoid it if I can, because I'm so bad at it. I prefer either to tell the story of a book or to pose a question that sums up the dilemma at the book's heart. I'll give you an example. I just sold a brilliant women's commercial fiction novel, unusually for me, because most of the time I'm doing nonfiction, by an author who had published 2 novels before that were spectacularly unsuccessful. They were really badly published. They sold about 500 copies each. The covers were terrible. And this really was the publisher's fault. So when it came to her 3rd novel, she knew that it was going to be hard to get around sales data. People would look up her previous sales and go, you don't sell. And that gave her sort of freedom. And she changed the rules. She spent 3 years writing this book rather than a year. She wrote about things that totally obsessed her, which were motherhood, universal themes about children, motherhood, families, aging, and so on. And the novels she produced were spectacularly good. We still had the problem of the sales data. Nonetheless, what's the book about? What the book is about is it asks a question of its reader, really, which is, you are parents. You have a daughter who's 18. She's your only child. You have a happy family life. There are the usual problems, but nothing serious. Aged 18, your daughter decides to leave home, never speak to you again, not tell you where she's living, not why she's done this, and then you don't know where she is or even if she's alive for the next few years. She is perfectly legally entitled to do that. And the book examines what you would do in that situation when you're facing a total unexplained silence. That's the pitch. So what I've just done is 2 things. The first part is the story behind the story, which is the way I get around this. What is the story of this author? Her career went wrong. She spent 3 years working on this. She's raised her game. This book is brilliant. The second part is the question. How do you get the editor to internalize that issue into their own life? What would they do in that situation before they've even started looking at the book? The book answers it in a very different way. But immediately the editor has made this book part of their internal consciousness. And that's the way I try and get around it. What happened with this book? We all live with rejection all the time. Being an agent is being a manic depressive, really. You go like this. And, but this one worked. I sent it out 2 weeks ago on Monday. An editor at Century Hutchinson in London read it the same day. 9:30 that night, I got a text saying, I've read half of it, I love it. I woke up the next morning to say, I finished it, I'm gonna buy it. 11 o'clock Tuesday, she made a big preemptive offer, but that wasn't why the author accepted it. The author accepted the offer because it came with a letter saying, I know exactly how to fix your career. We moved you up market, we put you in hardback, we get quotes from the following people. They got it wrong, I know how to do this. And the author accepted it for that reason. But for every story like that, there's one that goes wrong. And that's what I mean about being manic depressive. So it's an indirect way of answering how I pitch something. I do the story behind the story, and then I do either the pitch for the book or the question at the heart of the book. And as I say, everyone does things in their own way. And I've always envied people who can do that 101 Dalmatians meets Die Hard sort of thing. I can't do it. I've lost my track, sorry. What you always hope for, I mean, the key thing really with pitching, the best case scenario, if you get it right, is that you start a fire and then a sequence of fires that sort of start going around the world. Whether it's 1 line or 12, your pitch always needs to be something that can light other people up and allow them to pitch it themselves to other colleagues. They have to be portable, these pitches. They have to be transmissible. A pitch feeds down the line. That's the holy grail. So I've only got 4 things to say about pitching. And as I say, everyone does this in their own way, but these are my rules for myself. 1, never email a submission in cold. If you really can't speak to the editor, email them a question or 2 emails asking if they're the right person. Make the editor come towards you and ask for it. 2nd, think about the story behind the story, or the story behind the book idea. Where did it come from? Who's the author? What's unusual about it? 3, articulate the idea at the heart of the book. Right now, I'm trying to sell a book about life beyond the climate crisis. The idea is, what is the life of our grandchildren going to be like through the climate crisis? That's a way to get the editor to internalize it again. Think about the next generations. How will they live? 4, think about how a pitch feeds down the line. Sometimes really what you're doing is you're pitching to a sales team. The editor is the way through. Just be slightly aware that there are other people with other concerns, publicity, sales, whatever it is. But if you get it right, and then you know, the best possible case scenario, and it happens very, very rarely, but the best possible case scenario is when you get editors talking to each other around the world. Then they start selling the book for you. Someone in Norway will tell their friend in France. That editor will tell an editor in Italy. Suddenly you get a feeding frenzy going on around a book, but it's very, very rare. And it's often related to book fairs, which of course we've been denied. But anyway, thank you. I hope I haven't gone on too long. You know, and as I say, I'd be very interested to hear, how does anyone do a one-line pitch? I still want to know, so maybe you could tell me that.